My name is Eliana. I was born later in life to parents who had settled comfortably into their routines, already parenting a 19-year-old daughter they believed completed their family. "We didn't plan for you," my mother would say, not with harshness but with the casualness of commenting on the day's weather. She often hinted that, had it not been for my grandparents' encouragement, I might not have been born. It was evident that, while my birth brought immense joy to my grandparents, for my parents, I was a responsibility they had not originally sought. My sister Hannah was a teenager, absorbed in her world, filled with the typical pursuits of adolescence. She wasn't unkind, she simply lived as if I were invisible. While I entertained myself with toys in our living room's corner, she would lounge on the sofa, phone in hand, planning her future. "Hannah, honey, don't forget your SAT prep books," our mother would remind her, meticulously packing her backpack, while I sat at the kitchen table, silently wishing someone would notice I needed help with my homework. However, help rarely came. Instead, my parents fell into a routine that would define my childhood. Every morning, they would leave me at my grandparents' doorstep with a brief exchange. "You wanted her, she's all yours," my father would say to my grandfather, his keys jingling as he turned to leave for work. My grandparents' house became my true sanctuary. They nurtured me, supported my education, and filled my days with love and care, creating a stark contrast to the coldness of my parents' home. "Eliana," my grandmother would say, her hugs enveloping me each night. "You're the best thing that ever happened to us." In those moments, nestled in her loving embrace, I could nearly forget the indifference that awaited me elsewhere. As the years passed and Hannah left for college, I hoped for a change in my relationship with my parents. Yet, the reality was far different. The responsibilities that once belonged to Hannah now fell on me. "Eliana," my mother would call out as soon as I walked through the door from school, "the house needs cleaning. Start with the bathrooms." Chores and more responsibilities piled up, and I learned to navigate them all, from laundry to cooking, all the while longing for the recognition that seemed perpetually out of reach. Despite the challenges at home, my grandparents' unwavering affection taught me invaluable lessons about love and self-worth. One day, my grandfather would assure me, while we tackled my math homework, "You'll understand that sometimes the best things in life aren't planned." He'd wink, and for a moment, the burden of feeling unwanted would lift from my shoulders. Through their constant love and support, I learned what it meant to be truly valued, a stark contrast to the sense of being an afterthought in my own family. This dichotomy of experiences shaped my understanding of family, love, and self-worth, guiding me as I grew into someone who could appreciate the unplanned joys of life. Just as my grandparents had hoped, I made spaghetti one evening. It was a bit overcooked but still decent enough to eat. My parents dined in silence, barely acknowledging the meal, until my father finally spoke. "Tomorrow, try making something with chicken," he directed, his voice leaving no room for argument. It felt more like an order than a suggestion. For me, college was my beacon of hope. Each night, after I cleaned up from dinner, I'd escape to my room to explore university websites, dreaming about campuses far removed from the relentless household chores and the oppressive quiet of home. Then everything shifted. When I was 14, Hannah burst through the door one Sunday, excitement radiating from her as she introduced Matthew, a smartly dressed man who was now her fiancé. "Mom, Dad, this is Matthew. We're engaged." It was as if she had announced a major lottery win. My parents leaped up, overwhelmed with excitement. My mother burst into tears of joy, and my father immediately started calling relatives. "We'll pay for everything," my mother exclaimed, wrapping Hannah in a celebratory hug. The message was clear: Hannah's wedding was a priority, and no expense would be spared. The following months were a whirlwind of wedding planning. Discussions about venues, flowers, and guest lists dominated every meal. Money was no object, with discussions of designer dresses and top-tier vendors. My grandparents attended the wedding but seemed taken aback by the lavish spending, evident in their tight smiles and quiet discomfort at the extravagant displays, like the ice sculpture and champagne fountain. 3 years later, I sat at the dinner table with 3 college acceptance letters in front of me. Despite years of balancing extensive chores with maintaining excellent grades, I had managed to get into my top universities. Excitedly, I shared the news with my parents. "That's nice," my mother responded without even looking up from her plate, "but we can't afford to send you. We spent our savings on your sister's wedding and even took out a loan." "But you paid for Hannah's college," I protested, confused and hurt. "That was different," she said coldly, implying Hannah had a potential they didn't see in me. The silence that followed was suffocating. My acceptance letters suddenly felt like a cruel joke. "You should get a job," my father suggested indifferently. "Save some money, maybe take out a student loan. That's what responsible adults do." I left the table without permission, a bold act of defiance, and immediately called my grandmother. Tears blurred my vision as I made my way to their house, where I was met with hugs and comforting words. Between sobs, I poured out my frustrations and fears to my grandparents. My grandfather's expression hardened as he listened, but there was a flicker of something determined in his eyes. After I had calmed down, he and my grandmother exchanged a look that spoke volumes. "Eliana," my grandfather began, his voice firm yet kind, "we've been expecting something like this." They explained that they had observed the disparity in treatment between Hannah and me over the years. Standing up, my grandfather retrieved a folder from his study. Inside were bank statements, evidence of a fund they had been building since my birth, designated for my education. "You could choose any of those colleges," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "We've got you covered." That night, I returned home and packed the essentials, ready to start a new chapter. Downstairs, my parents were absorbed with the TV, barely noticing as I moved around. The reality of their indifference stung, but the promise of a future supported by those who truly valued me filled me with hope and determination. When I announced my decision to move in with my grandparents, my mother's response was nonchalant. "Whatever you think is best," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the television. Was there a hint of relief in her voice? The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of college prep. I decided to major in financial analysis, inspired in part by witnessing my parents' haphazard approach to managing their finances. My grandparents were instrumental in getting me ready, assisting with everything from application forms to shopping for my college supplies. Starting college that fall marked the beginning of a new chapter. The subjects were challenging, but I was invigorated by the learning process. Every lecture was a step further from my past and closer to a promising future. My professors quickly took note of my passion, and I often stayed after class to delve deeper into complex financial theories. For the first time, someone outside my immediate family recognized and encouraged my potential. In my sophomore year, during one of our regular phone chats, my grandmother shared some news about Hannah. "Your sister's having trouble," she revealed. Hannah's career in marketing was floundering, and Matthew was struggling to maintain steady employment. They frequently needed financial help, which my parents provided without hesitation. My grandmother sighed as she told me about the latest bailout involving my mother's retirement savings to cover their rent. A year later, the situation deteriorated further. Unable to afford their living expenses, even with continuous financial support, Hannah and Matthew moved back into my childhood bedroom, the room I had kept immaculate for so many years. The irony of it stung, yet it was a stark contrast to my circumstances. By then, I was excelling in my internships at prestigious financial institutions, gaining recognition for my knack for unraveling complex financial puzzles. My supervisor at Morgan Stanley was impressed, hinting at future opportunities with them. I remained focused on my studies, with my family rarely crossing my mind except during conversations with my grandparents. However, during a visit in my senior year, I immediately sensed something was off. The atmosphere was heavy, the usual warmth replaced by a forced cheerfulness from my grandmother and uncharacteristic silence from my grandfather. "What's wrong?" I pressed during dinner, noticing their evasive movements. After a moment of hesitance, my grandfather revealed the troubling truth. "Your parents came to us last week," he said, exhaustion evident in his voice. "They wanted their inheritance early." "Why would they need that?" I asked, setting down my fork. They're in deep trouble with the banks, my grandmother explained. Multiple loans, credit card debt. They said they needed $500,000 to stave off bankruptcy. And you gave it to them? I couldn't hide my frustration. My grandfather nodded solemnly. We had to, Eliana. They're still our children, and we couldn't just watch them fail. I was furious. After all the enabling of Hannah's irresponsibility and the indifferent treatment I had received, it was hard to accept their decision. But that was most of your savings, sweetheart, my grandmother said, reaching across the table to grasp my hand gently. We know you're upset, but what's done is done. We'll manage. The dinner continued, but the air was thick with unspoken words and my unresolved feelings. Despite the turmoil, the support and sacrifice of my grandparents were evident, reinforcing the stark contrasts in familial love and responsibility I had experienced growing up. I couldn't shake my anger. My parents, who never prioritized my education and treated me more like a housekeeper than a daughter, had boldly asked my grandparents for money. This was despite their chronic inability to manage their finances or refuse anything to Hannah. Meanwhile, my dedication was paying dividends. After graduation, bolstered by strong recommendations from my professors and a series of successful internships, I secured a job at a prestigious financial firm in the city. The salary was beyond anything I had dared to dream of. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment, nothing extravagant, but it was mine, clean and secure. Each morning, I reveled in the simplicity of making breakfast just for myself, free from the demands of others. My career advanced rapidly. I embraced every challenge, earning promotions and bonuses that would have seemed fantastical to my younger self. Within a few years, I had saved enough for a down payment on a house. The day I signed the mortgage, my thoughts drifted to my family, still entangled in poor financial decisions, completely unaware of my achievements. We hadn't spoken in years. Then, out of the blue, I received a call that changed everything. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack and passed away. By the time I got to the hospital, less than 3 months later, my grandmother also passed away, seeming to have lost her will to live without him. During the funeral arrangements, I heard a voice behind me that I hadn't heard in years. It was my mother, looking worn and tired. Part of me wanted to send her away, but something in her weary eyes stopped me. Sure, I found myself saying. That would be nice. Over the next few days, as we planned the service together, my parents began to open up about their struggles. Retirement had hit them hard financially, and Hannah, now with twin boys, still relied heavily on them. A week after we laid my grandmother to rest, we gathered for the will reading in a wood-paneled office. The air was thick with a scent of old paper and furniture polish, and the tension was palpable. The notary, Mr. Carter, began to read in a monotone voice. I braced for standard legal phrases, but what followed caught everyone off guard. To our beloved granddaughter, Eliana, we leave our house in the sum of $230,000, he announced. The room fell silent. Hannah's jaw dropped, and my mother's hand clenched around my father's arm. Mr. Carter continued, and a personal note from Mr. Lincoln to his daughter Sophie. He turned to my mother. Sophie, remember that we gave you $500,000 when you needed it most. This is our final decision, and we trust you will respect it as we respect your needs. My mother's face turned from red to pale. My father stared at the ground, and Hannah and Matthew exchanged anxious glances. After the reading, my parents approached me in the parking lot, their demeanor composed yet visibly shaken. They seemed about to speak, perhaps to explain themselves or to seek reconciliation. However, the moment was laden with a history of choices and consequences, a reminder of the divergent paths our lives had taken. Guided by the values instilled in me by the very people who had now left me their legacy, despite the display of cooperation during the funeral arrangements, any semblance of unity quickly dissolved, replaced by an almost desperate demeanor from my parents. Eliana, honey, my mother began, her voice trembling, you have to understand, we always thought we'd inherit the house. We were really counting on it. We're struggling, my father chimed in, his hand threading through his graying hair. With the mortgage, Hannah's family's expenses, we could really use the house. I looked at them, recalling the years of feeling unwanted and the clear neglect. Their refusal to support my education was still fresh in my mind. "No," I said firmly. "The house is mine." That's what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. They persisted, following me to my car, pleading their case. Hannah joined in too, arguing her boys needed a yard to play in. I didn't waver. I simply got into my car and drove away. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother asking me over for dinner. There was something different in her tone, perhaps a hint of humility. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Pulling up to my childhood home was like stepping into a dimly remembered past. Only now, everything appeared more run-down than I recalled, the paint peeling, the gutters sagging, and the lawn overgrown. Inside, the house was crowded. But clean. Hannah's twins, Roman and Axel, were a whirlwind of energy in the living room, their laughter echoing as Matthew half-heartedly attempted to calm them. "Eliana," my mother said, pulling me into an awkward hug, "we made your favorite pot roast." "That's not my favorite," I corrected automatically. "That's Hannah's favorite." An uncomfortable silence fell, eventually broken by my father clearing his throat. "Well, why don't you tell us what your favorite food is? We'd love to know." Surprisingly, they were genuinely interested. Over dinner, they inquired about my job, my apartment, and my hobbies. They listened intently as I talked about my work in finance, although I could tell much of it went over their heads. That dinner led to another, and then another. Soon, I was joining them for holidays, bringing gifts for the twins, and even helping Hannah with their homework. Sometimes, when they mentioned that the house needed repairs, I offered to help. I paid for a new roof, fixed the heating system, and repainted the exterior. Each time I wrote a check, my parents would tear up with gratitude. "You're too good to us," my mother would say, embracing me. "We don't deserve this." "You're right," I would think but never say aloud. Despite everything, a small part of me still wanted to believe people could change. As the years passed and my career flourished, my investment portfolio grew substantially. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents seemed to strengthen. They were aging, both over 68 now, and I wanted to do something meaningful for them. "I've been thinking," I said during one of our Sunday dinners, observing my father struggle to rise from his chair. "This house isn't really suitable for you anymore. I want to buy you a new house, something single-story, with a nice garden, but easier to maintain, something comfortable for your retirement years." Their reaction was one of genuine joy, tears streaming down their faces. We spent the next few weeks house hunting together and finally found the perfect place, a beautiful ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood with wide doorways and no stairs. After closing, my parents couldn't stop talking about how excited they were. "We need to have a proper housewarming party," my father declared, his spirits lifted. "Let us arrange everything. It's the least we can do." "That would be lovely," I agreed, seeing this as a new beginning in our amended relationship, a blend of forgiveness and cautious optimism about our future interactions. I had planned to surprise my parents with a house deed at their big celebration, so I waited for an invite to mark my calendar. As weeks turned into months, I juggled a hectic work schedule but kept an ear out for news of the party. Whenever I inquired, my mom would always say they were still ironing out the details, aiming for perfection. My dad would assure me, "We'll notify you soon," but their responses always seemed a bit off. Curiosity led me one night to search for my sister, Hannah, on Facebook, where I stumbled upon her recent post about a housewarming party happening that very Saturday. The pictures showed a beautifully decorated house and caterers preparing for the event. It was clear this had been planned well in advance. Feeling sidelined, I called my mom to casually confirm the party details. She glossed over my question, maintaining that the date hadn't been set yet. It became apparent I was deliberately left out. On the day, I parked a block from the house I had purchased for them. Laughter and music echoed down the street. Through the windows, I saw a house full of guests enjoying the evening without me. I entered unnoticed and found my way to the living room, where my father was proudly telling guests about their hard-earned dream home. My mom proudly mentioned how Hannah had helped significantly with the down payment, praising her generosity in front of the crowd. A guest commented on the importance of family support, prompting my mom to remark sharply, "Unlike some people, probably too busy with work to care about family." That was my cue. I interrupted. "Actually, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, as all eyes turned to me. "This house, I bought it, and it seems I've been forgotten in all these plans." The room fell silent. My father attempted to recover, feigning surprise at my presence. I countered, quite the surprise, considering I wasn't even invited to my own housewarming. Tensions rose as my mom defensively said, "Well, you got it, but it's ours now. We can't be expected to thank you forever." My dad boldly added, "You're not welcome here. This is a family event, and it's Hannah and her family who will be living here." As they revealed, Hannah had already sold her home. I couldn't help but laugh at the audacity. I pulled out the deed from my bag and displayed it to the room. "You seem to be confused," I stated, showing everyone the document that proved my ownership. "This house is mine, and it seems there's been quite the mistake. I had never transferred the ownership of the house to my parents. I planned to officially hand it over to them at what I had hoped would be a joyful housewarming party. When I revealed the reality, that the house was still mine and not theirs as they had presumed, the color drained from my mother's face, turning it ghostly pale. My father struggled for words. Facing the room full of shocked guests, I announced, "I would like everyone to please leave now. This is my house, and the party is over." At this, my mother's disbelief erupted into a shrill protest. "You can't do this. We are your parents." I replied softly, yet firmly, "No, you just brought me into this world. My real parents, my grandparents, taught me that family is more than just a genetic link. They also taught me how to handle my finances, which is why I am the owner of this house." With tears in their eyes, my parents, Hannah, Matthew, their twins, and all their friends slowly left. I stood on the front porch, watching as each car pulled away, leaving the street deserted. In the weeks that followed, I heard that they had used the proceeds from selling their previous home to purchase an apartment. Hannah, Matthew, and the twins moved in with my parents. They attempted to reach out to me several times, but I blocked their numbers, emails, and social media accounts. Eventually, I sold the house, depositing the proceeds into my bank account. This whole ordeal made a resolve in me. When I have children of my own, they will never have to vie for my affection or prove their worth for my love. Unlike my parents, I will cherish my children equally and unconditionally, just as my grandparents cherished me.